In Elizabethan England, there existed a form of torture so excruciating that even the executioners recoiled from their task, a punishment where the state slowly crushed a human body beneath a rising mountain of stones. And that is precisely how Margaret Clitherow, a young mother known as the Pearl of York, met one of history's most horrific deaths, her ribs cracking like splinters while she whispered prayers into the darkness. And yet this is not merely the story of one woman's brutal execution, but a hidden truth lurking beneath the gleaming myths of Tudor glory, a dark history that reveals how faith was weaponized into a tool of terror, and how the pursuit of religious conformity led England into acts of such savage cruelty that even those who enforced the law were haunted by the blood on their hands. This is the untold chronicle of Catholic persecution, of a world where harboring a priest was branded treason, where simply attending a forbidden mass could see you fined into ruin or tortured into silence, and where a government obsessed with loyalty turned neighbors into spies and family members into informants. It is a chilling reminder that for every story of Elizabeth I's golden age, there lies a darker counter-narrative, a hidden history soaked in fear and secrecy, in clandestine rituals and desperate whispers behind locked doors. Margaret Clitherow chose faith over fear, conviction over compromise, and ultimately silence over life itself, making a decision so terrifying and selfless that it would transform her from a butcher's wife into a martyr, whose name would echo through centuries as a symbol of resistance against tyranny. And while the history books might praise the triumphs of Elizabethan England, they often whisper only in cautious footnotes about the woman crushed to death because she refused to betray her faith, a woman whose execution was not simply punishment, but a spectacle designed to terrify an entire population into obedience, proving that in the war between faith and fear, the human spirit can endure even the most brutal torture. If you believe you understand the cost of freedom, prepare yourself, because the true story of Margaret Clitherow is about to drag you into a world where dark history, torture, and hidden truths collide, revealing the price one woman paid for refusing to let faith die beneath the crushing weight of stones. England in 1586 was not the fairy tale kingdom of glittering courts and glorious victories that modern nostalgia so often paints. It was a nation trembling under a relentless campaign of religious persecution, where fear ruled each breath, and the very air in the streets of towns like York seemed heavy with the scent of betrayal and hidden terror for under the crown of Elizabeth I. Protestantism had been enshrined as the official religion, and anything that deviated from this rigid doctrine was branded treason, a crime punishable not merely by imprisonment but by torture, by brutal execution, and sometimes by death so horrific they were intended to echo in the nightmares of an entire population, ensuring that silence and conformity remained the only choices for survival. And yet this is the dark history, the hidden truth seldom spoken aloud, that the celebrated Elizabethan Golden Age was also a time drenched in blood secrecy and the quiet sobs of those who refused to renounce their faith. It was an era when the government turned religion into a weapon deploying fear as both policy and spectacle, proving that in the battle between faith and fear, the machinery of power would stop at nothing to keep its grip on the hearts and minds of the realm. The Elizabethan settlement of 1559, often presented in textbooks as a stroke of political genius that stabilized England, was in reality a blade that cut deep into the soul of the nation, for it declared the Anglican Church the sole path to salvation and transformed every Catholic ritual into a potential act of treason. The Mass, once the heartbeat of English spiritual life, became contraband, while statues of saints were smashed from altars, and the Virgin Mary, once revered as Queen of Heaven, became an icon that could lead a man to the scaffold or a woman to the rack. The echoes of Henry VIII's earlier break with Rome still haunted the land, but Elizabeth's government elevated religious surveillance to new heights, creating a sprawling network of spies, informants, and priest hunters who scoured cities and countryside alike, ever hungry for hints of hidden altars, forbidden prayers, or the clandestine arrival of seminary priests who slipped across the channel disguised as merchants, driven by a mission to keep the embers of Catholic faith burning in a kingdom determined to snuff them out. And this was no idle fear, for across the sea, the specter of Catholic invasion loomed large, with powerful figures like Philip II of Spain and the Pope himself plotting the overthrow of Elizabeth, while domestic conspiracies like the Ridolfi plot and the Throckmorton plot fueled the government's paranoia, transforming every priest into a potential assassin and every Catholic household into a possible cell of sedition waiting to explode into violent rebellion. Within this suffocating atmosphere, laws grew increasingly savage, each more draconian than the last, designed not merely to punish, but to terrorize. The Act of 1581 decreed that any attempt to convert an English subject to Catholicism or to be converted was high treason, an offense punishable by death, while simply attending a secret mass could cost an ordinary family fines, so crushing that financial ruin was guaranteed for the penalty for saying mass soared to 200 marks, and a year's imprisonment, and even hearing mass carried a fine of 100 marks, and a year behind bars, sums that might be trifling to noble families, but would obliterate the savings of merchants, tradesmen, and butchers like John Clitherow, Margaret's Protestant husband, whose respectable status in York's Merchant Adventurers Company could not shield him from suspicion if his wife's clandestine activities were exposed. But perhaps the most insidious weapon wielded by the Crown was psychological warfare, as neighbors were coaxed into betraying neighbors. Servants were bribed or threatened into becoming informants, and families were torn apart by the poison of fear. For the government offered hefty rewards for any tip that led to the arrest of a priest or the discovery of forbidden Catholic rites, sowing a culture of suspicion where a careless word whispered behind closed doors might echo all the way to the torturers in the Tower of London. In the streets of York, Margaret Clitherow's city, the danger felt omnipresent, for this northern stronghold lay close to the Scottish border, making it a critical gateway for priests returning from the continent, young men often educated at Oxford or Cambridge who, driven by a fierce conviction, smuggled themselves back into England, knowing full well that the penalty awaiting them was not merely arrest, but a death so gruesome it was designed to break the resolve of all who might dare follow in their footsteps, for to be a priest in Elizabethan England was to accept the looming shadow of hanging, drawing, and quartering, a punishment so savage that even hardened executioners sometimes blanched as they ripped a man's chest open and tore out his still-beating heart to hold aloft before a screaming crowd, while the condemned, if fortune deserted him, might remain conscious enough to witness the mutilation of his own body in the ultimate theater of fear. A spectacle intended not merely to punish the guilty, but to terrorize the entire Catholic community into submission. And while the wealthy might navigate the dangers with hidden chapels and bribed officials, for ordinary Catholics, these laws transformed daily life into a treacherous balancing act, where the price of fidelity to the old faith was measured in blood, terror, and poverty, forcing countless souls to choose between the salvation of their eternal souls and the preservation of their earthly lives. For in Elizabethan England, faith itself had become an act of defiance, a secret resistance waged behind shuttered windows under cover of night, in whispered Latin prayers spoken by trembling voices who never knew if the next knock on the door would be the arrival of salvation or the agents of the crown come to drag them away in chains. And it was precisely within this crucible of faith and fear, amidst the swirl of dark history and hidden truths, that Margaret Clitherow emerged. A woman whose decision to defy the crushing weight of state power would propel her from the modest confines of York's shambles district into the annals of martyrdom. For Margaret was no mere participant in this deadly game. She was about to become one of its most extraordinary figures, a silent storm whose quiet conviction would lead her to a brutal execution so horrifying that it still echoes across the centuries. A woman who chose the agony of torture rather than betray those she loved. And as we turn now to the story of her life, it becomes impossible not to wonder how such an ordinary wife and mother could summon the courage to face a death so savage, to stand firm against the machinery of a government determined to crush her into dust, and to leave behind a legacy that continues to whisper from the shadows of history, demanding that we ask ourselves how far we would go to protect our deepest beliefs. Margaret Clitherow's life began far from the shadows of torture chambers and secret altars, for she was born in 1556 into the busy, respectable world of York's shambles district. The daughter of a wax chandler whose trade lit both churches and households alike, and in those early years, her existence seemed destined to follow the ordinary pattern of an Elizabethan woman's fate: marriage, motherhood, obedience to the Protestant state, and the quiet rhythms of daily life. Yet the hidden truth lurking beneath the surface of Elizabethan England was that no life remained untouched by the ruthless war between faith and fear. And even a butcher's wife could find herself swept into the violent storm of religious persecution driven not by politics or ambition, but by the private convictions of the soul. And so Margaret's journey from the bustling stalls of the shambles to the suffocating weight of a wooden door crushing her chest was not merely a personal tragedy, but a testament to how dark secrets could transform the most ordinary existence into a saga of courage, sacrifice, and ultimately martyrdom, revealing that in Elizabethan England, the price of conscience was often paid in blood. At the age of 15, Margaret married John Clitherow, a prosperous butcher, whose business thrived amidst the chaos of York's market streets, a man respected in both the guilds and the civic life of the city, and for a time, Margaret's days flowed with the same measured regularity as countless other wives in the kingdom, tending to her home, raising her children, and navigating the delicate social dance required of a Protestant household under the watchful gaze of Elizabeth's loyal authorities, yet somewhere around the year 1574. When Margaret was barely 18 and already a mother of two, a slow and quiet revolution began to smolder in her heart, ignited not by any single dramatic event, but by the accumulation of small moments, a conversation whispered through the iron bars of York Castle with a Catholic priest, imprisoned for his faith perhaps, or the solemn glow of a forbidden mass glimpsed through a half-open door, and in those clandestine encounters, Margaret discovered a hidden history, a spiritual path that felt truer and deeper than the doctrines the state commanded her to recite. And so she crossed a line invisible to most, but deadly to all who dared transgress it, embracing Catholicism in a kingdom that demanded absolute obedience to the Protestant crown. Her conversion was no loud declaration, but a quiet, deliberate choice. And though she continued outwardly to perform the motions of Protestant life within the chambers of her soul, Margaret was building a fortress of conviction so strong that even the machinery of Elizabethan torture would ultimately fail to tear it down. For this was not merely a question of ritual, but of identity itself, of a faith she believed tied directly to salvation and eternal destiny. And as she moved deeper into the secret world of forbidden worship, Margaret's courage and intelligence soon caught the attention of those who risked everything to keep the Catholic faith alive in York, for she possessed a calm boldness that allowed her to navigate suspicion-hide dangerous objects in plain sight and earn the trust of both priests and fellow believers who depended on absolute secrecy for their survival, revealing a side of her that few outside her hidden circles would ever see, a side forged not in the comfort of religious certainty, but in the fire of relentless danger. Despite her increasing involvement in what the crown would have deemed treasonous activity, Margaret maintained her role as a devoted wife and mother, managing her household with skill and grace. And here lay one of the most remarkable contradictions in her story, for the same woman who risked torture and execution to protect Catholic priests was also the mother who taught her children to read Latin prayers, the wife who kept her husband's business running smoothly even as she funneled funds into the clandestine network of the underground church, and the neighbor who traded smiles and pleasantries in the shambles market while harboring fugitives beneath her roof. And though John Clitherow remained officially Protestant, he seems to have chosen a deliberate blindness to his wife's activities, either out of love, fear, or the simple human desire to preserve the fragile peace of his family's existence in a kingdom where secrets could be deadly for in Elizabethan England. Silence was often the only defense left to those caught between faith and fear. Margaret's home slowly transformed from a modest family dwelling into a hub of covert resistance, and the upstairs rooms once intended for family life began to serve as hidden chapels, where Mass was said in hushed Latin, the faint scent of incense curling through the beams, while lookouts watched for sudden raids, and Margaret herself acquired religious artifacts and Catholic books, objects whose mere possession could lead to fines, imprisonment, or worse. And she taught herself Latin to follow the sacred words of the liturgy more closely, a seemingly small act that in the context of the era became an act of rebellion, for in those syllables of ancient prayers, Margaret found a connection to a faith she deemed eternal and pure, a faith worth dying for, even as Elizabeth's agents closed ever tighter around her. And the financial burden of maintaining such a dangerous operation was staggering, for priests needed food, shelter, clothing, and safe passage. and Margaret poured much of the profits from her husband's successful butcher business into funding the survival of this hidden church, spending freely on vestments, altarpieces, and all the secret implements necessary for preserving a forbidden faith, revealing that in Elizabethan England, the war for souls was waged not only in pulpits and royal proclamations, but also in the private ledgers of household accounts and the concealed passageways beneath timbered roofs. Margaret's story was never that of a mere passive victim swept along by events. She chose her path with eyes open, knowing the punishment that awaited those who defied the crown, for she had witnessed firsthand the savage fate of priests captured by Elizabeth's spies, young men who vanished into dungeons only to re-emerge on the gallows disemboweled and quartered before jeering crowds. And still she persisted, driven by an unshakable belief that true faith demanded more than silent agreement. It demanded action, sacrifice, and the willingness to stand alone if necessary. And this was the woman who, in the dark years of England's religious terror, became the very heartbeat of Catholic resistance in York, orchestrating secret gatherings, guiding priests through hidden routes, and shaping the spiritual lives of the next generation, until her courage grew too large to remain concealed, until the forces of the crown came crashing through her door, determined to silence her forever. And it is there, in the shadows of her clandestine network, that the next chapter of Margaret Clitherow's extraordinary and ultimately tragic story begins. Margaret Clitherow's house in the narrow labyrinth of York's Shambles district stood like any other, its timber beams leaning slightly over the cobblestone streets below, the scent of butchered meat wafting from the family shopfront as customers bustled past. Yet behind its ordinary facade pulsed a secret network so daring, so meticulously orchestrated, that it would one day provoke the wrath of Elizabethan England's most feared agents. For within those timber walls, Margaret built not merely a safe house, but a fortress of faith, a hidden world where forbidden masses whispered into the dark, where priests were smuggled from room to room, and where every shadow might conceal salvation or death, revealing that in a kingdom obsessed with control, the greatest acts of rebellion often hid in plain sight, and that the price of such defiance could be nothing less than life itself. For Margaret was not simply a devout believer. She became the logistical genius behind a clandestine Catholic resistance that stretched far beyond York, proving that even under the crushing weight of torture and brutal execution, the human spirit could forge an underground empire dedicated to preserving faith against a state determined to crush it into oblivion. Above the Clitherow butcher shop, the upstairs rooms were transformed from humble family quarters into secret chapels where the scent of burning incense mingled with damp timber and flickering candlelight danced across hidden altars, and Margaret oversaw it all with a vigilance that was part spiritual devotion, part battlefield strategy. For in Elizabethan England, conducting a single mass was enough to invite torture and death. And yet Margaret hosted them repeatedly, ensuring that priests returning from the continent, often gaunt from their perilous journeys, could administer sacraments, baptize children, and sustain the flickering hope of Yorkshire's beleaguered Catholic community. And in those moments, the hidden history of England breathed anew, for these gatherings were not merely religious rituals, but acts of defiance against a government whose spies and informants stalked every parish and market square, seeking any trace of the forbidden faith. And Margaret's home became a place where the stakes were nothing less than salvation or the scaffold. Margaret constructed elaborate hiding places within her home panels that slid away to reveal priest holes so narrow that grown men could barely turn their shoulders, secret compartments beneath floorboards where sacred vessels and forbidden books could vanish in an instant, and concealed stairways that led through labyrinthine passages designed to baffle any intruder who dared storm the house, searching for Catholic fugitives. And these hidden spaces were the architectural expression of a spiritual war, for every beam and brick in Margaret's house became part of the silent resistance, proving that in Elizabethan England even the walls had secrets, and it was here within this fortress of timber and faith that the true battle between faith and fear played out in grim, relentless silence. Messages between safe houses passed in cryptic signals. A certain arrangement of meat in the shop window might mean a priest had arrived safely. A coded phrase whispered in the marketplace might signal that Mass would be said that night. And Margaret herself became the master of this clandestine language, balancing her role as a merchant's wife with that of a covert commander, orchestrating the survival of an entire religious community. And these operations demanded a level of secrecy and discipline akin to espionage for a single slip of the tongue, A single wrong glance from a suspicious neighbor could bring the full force of Elizabeth's government crashing down upon her and everyone she loved. And yet Margaret persisted, pouring her wealth and her soul into keeping the forbidden rituals alive, while the threat of torture loomed ever closer, proving that the quiet courage of a single woman could rival the armies of a queen. The priests who found refuge in Margaret's house were young, educated, and marked for death from the moment they set foot on English soil. For they came from seminaries scattered across the European continent, trained to minister to a flock that worshipped in shadows, and upon returning, they were hunted like traitors, forced to travel disguised as merchants or students, carrying only the barest belongings, and the knowledge that discovery meant a brutal execution for Elizabethan torture was not content merely to kill. It sought to make examples to break bodies and spirits in spectacles of cruelty that would terrify the entire realm. And Margaret knew these risks intimately, for each priest she sheltered was another name the authorities would add to the ledgers of death. And yet she opened her doors, clothed them, fed them, nursed their wounds, and plotted their safe passage through an increasingly hostile kingdom, revealing that her loyalty to her faith was not an abstract principle but a daily commitment measured in danger and sacrifice. Beyond sheltering priests, Margaret became a clandestine educator, transforming her hidden chapel into a classroom where children learned Latin prayers, the histories of saints, and the rituals forbidden under Protestant law. For under Elizabeth's reign, Catholic parents faced a torturous choice: send their children to Protestant schools and risk the erosion of their faith, or keep them home and educate them secretly, risking arrest and financial ruin. And Margaret took it upon herself to preserve the faith for the next generation, knowing that if the knowledge died with her, so too might the hope of any Catholic resurgence in England. And these quiet lessons whispered above the butcher shop were as dangerous as any sermon, for they wove the very fabric of a hidden church that refused to die, no matter how many priests were executed, no matter how many believers were fined, imprisoned, or crushed under the weight of stones. The economic burden of maintaining this underground resistance was staggering, for priests required constant sustenance and mobility. Secret masses demanded supplies smuggled from abroad, wine for communion, vestments for ceremonies, books that carried the weight of forbidden truths, and Margaret emptied her purse, time and again using the profits from John Clitherow's successful butcher business to finance a religious rebellion unfolding behind locked doors, proving that even commerce in Elizabethan England could become a front line in the war between faith and fear. And while John chose to remain officially Protestant and often absent, perhaps deliberately avoiding knowledge of his wife's actions, Margaret assumed the full weight of responsibility for this hidden empire, knowing that discovery would mean not only her own death, but the possible destruction of the entire network she had helped build. And yet, she continued, driven by a conviction so fierce that neither torture nor brutal execution could extinguish it. For in the shadows of Elizabethan England, Margaret Clitherow's house stood as both sanctuary and battleground, a place where faith dared to defy the crown. But the machinery of Elizabeth's surveillance was relentless, tightening its grip with each passing year, and even Margaret's flawless network could not remain invisible forever. For spies and informants prowled York's streets, hungry for the bounty offered to those who betrayed Catholic secrets. And as we shall soon see, a single frightened child's confession would shatter the delicate web Margaret had spun, unleashing a chain of events that would drag her from the shadows of clandestine resistance into the glaring light of Tudor justice, and toward a fate so brutal that its echoes still chill the blood centuries later. Margaret Clitherow's fortress of faith, so meticulously constructed amid the timber beams and narrow alleys of York, ultimately fell not to the relentless searches of Elizabethan priest hunters, nor to the watchful eyes of suspicious neighbors, but to the trembling voice of a single child. For in March of 1586, as winter's chill clung to the stones of York's ancient walls, a Flemish boy of barely 11 years, who had been living under Margaret's roof as part of her clandestine household, was seized and interrogated by government agents, and whether his confession was torn from him through threats, subtle manipulations, or outright torture remains a detail swallowed by the shadows of history. Yet his words detonated like a hidden powder keg, spilling the hidden truth of the Clitherow household. The secret chapel concealed behind false walls, the priests sheltered within its rooms, the priest holes carved into the very bones of the house, and the identity of Father John Mush. The seminary priest then hiding under Margaret's protection, and with that single confession, the entire underground network Margaret had helped weave across Yorkshire trembled on the brink of ruin, revealing how in Elizabethan England the price of survival could be measured not merely in courage or cunning, but in the fragile loyalty of even the smallest, most innocent soul, and proving that in a kingdom ruled by fear, betrayal was often bought for the price of a child's terror. The government's response was swift and merciless, for in the pre-dawn hours of March 10, 1586, Sheriff Thomas Knivet and his men gathered quietly in York's twisting streets, waiting for the moment when the city still slumbered and the Clitherow household would be at its most vulnerable. And as the gray light of dawn began to creep over the rooftops, casting long shadows across the cobblestones, slick with night's moisture, the sheriff's men burst through the door, shattering the fragile calm of the Clitherow household, and there, amidst the clatter of overturned chairs and the terrified cries of servants, Margaret Clitherow rose from the breakfast table, her trained eyes reading in an instant the grim determination of the officers, the careful precision of their movements revealing that this was no routine inspection, but the culmination of a meticulously planned raid driven by intelligence gathered from within her own walls. And though her heart must have thundered like a drum, Margaret remained composed, for she knew that panic was a luxury she could not afford, not with the lives of priests, servants, and even her own children hanging in the balance. The search that followed was relentless, systematic, and conducted with the cold efficiency of men who had performed such dark duties many times before. For the officers tore through every room of the house, rapping on wooden panels for hidden hollows, measuring floorboards for suspicious gaps, and scrutinizing every piece of furniture for concealed compartments. And eventually they found it the secret chapel hidden behind false walls. The altar draped in fine cloth, the vestments carefully folded, and stashed away the sacred vessels gleaming dully in the dim torchlight. And to the eyes of Elizabeth's men, this was not merely evidence of private devotion, but proof of high treason. For the very existence of these items was an indictment. A hidden history laid bare, and as they rifled through Margaret's home, they uncovered not only religious artifacts, but correspondence with other Catholic households, lists of safe houses, and documents that could unravel the entire clandestine network Margaret had dedicated her life to protecting, revealing that in Elizabethan England, every scrap of paper could become a death warrant, and every hidden object a silent accusation. Even as the evidence mounted and her household trembled under the weight of approaching disaster, Margaret displayed a calm so extraordinary that even the sheriff's men took note, for she watched the dissection of her secret world with an almost supernatural composure, her eyes betraying neither fear nor anger, but the resigned certainty of a woman who knew that her fate had been sealed the moment the boy had spoken. And yet, even in the face of overwhelming danger, her mind worked tirelessly, calculating how much time Father Mush might need to slip away through the hidden passages she had prepared for exactly this kind of siege for Margaret's loyalty to the priests. She sheltered was absolute, and she seemed determined, even in her own downfall, to save as many lives as possible from the brutal machinery of Elizabethan justice, for she understood better than most that in this kingdom of faith versus fear, a single arrest could trigger a chain of confessions that would drag entire communities into ruin. When the officers finally led her away in chains, the bustling streets of York seemed to pause as news of Margaret Clitherow's arrest rippled outward like a stone cast into still water. For in a city already trembling under the weight of religious suspicion, this was the event everyone had feared. The shattering of the myth that the underground Catholic network was invisible, untouchable, and secure. And as Margaret was escorted through York's gates toward the looming walls of York Castle, the eyes of townsfolk followed her with a mixture of horror, sympathy, and dread, for they knew that the government would not simply imprison such a figure, but would make of her a spectacle, an example meant to terrify others into submission. And whispers spread quickly through the city's crowded markets and taverns, speculating on what tortures might await her behind the castle's stone walls. For Elizabethan England was a place where justice was often administered, not with the scales of fairness, but with instruments of agony designed to wring confessions from body and soul alike. The irony of Margaret's downfall lay bitter and cruel, for after years of outwitting government spies, orchestrating secret masses, and evading the watchful gaze of priest hunters, she was undone not by professional interrogators but by the frightened words of a child who had once trusted her, a betrayal that cut deeper than any blade, for it was not merely the destruction of her secret chapel, nor the impending torture that awaited her, that brought the true agony, but the knowledge that those who depended on her priest's servants' children might now be forced into the glare of the courtroom, compelled to testify to betray their own faith under the threat of torture or ruin, and Margaret, who had spent her life shielding others from the machinery of Elizabethan persecution, now faced the ultimate test of whether she could protect those she loved from the consequences of her capture. For the hidden truth of Tudor justice was that it demanded not only the punishment of the guilty, but the exposure of entire networks, and Margaret's silence would soon become her most dangerous and most heroic weapon. As the heavy gates of York Castle closed behind her, Margaret Clitherow stepped into a darkness far deeper than any priest hole she had ever crafted, for the interrogations were yet to begin, the trial yet to unfold. And as we turn next to the courtroom where faith and fear would collide under the flickering light of Tudor torches, we will see how Margaret's unwavering resolve would transform an ordinary butcher's wife into a symbol of martyrdom whose echo still resounds in the dark corners of history. The heavy doors of York Castle closed behind Margaret Clitherow, with the echo of finality ushering her into a world where the flickering glow of torchlight cast monstrous shadows on stone walls slick with centuries of damp. And as she was led down the narrow corridors toward her cell, every step brought her closer to a reckoning that would shake not only her own fate, but the very foundations of Elizabethan England's machinery of terror. For the Crown did not merely seek to imprison Margaret. It intended to make an example of her, to break her spirit, force her confession, and extract from her the secrets of the clandestine Catholic network she had spent years building. Yet beneath her calm exterior pulsed a resolve as unyielding as iron, and Margaret understood in every fiber of her being that the battle she now faced was not merely for her own survival, but for the lives of priests' servants and her own children. For in a kingdom where the balance between faith and fear had become a daily tightrope walk, Margaret Clitherow was about to become the ultimate test case of whether a single woman's silence could withstand the crushing weight of an empire determined to extract the hidden truth at any cost, revealing the dark history lurking beneath the myth of Elizabeth's golden age, where justice often wore the mask of brutality and torture was not merely punishment, but a performance designed to crush the spirit of dissent. When Margaret was brought before the judges at the York Assizes in March of 1586, the courtroom thrummed with anticipation, packed with Protestant officials, city magistrates, and the ever-curious public who had gathered to witness the downfall of the woman who had become the beating heart of Yorkshire's Catholic resistance. And yet, as Margaret stood before them, small in stature, but radiating an unshakable calm, she seemed to transform the chamber from a tribunal of terror into a theater of defiance, for she knew that the fate awaiting her was not merely the gallows, but a death designed to terrify all who might dare follow in her footsteps. And as Judge Clench leaned forward, his voice echoing through the stone hall, he demanded that Margaret enter a plea to the charges laid against her, harboring seminary priests, aiding traitors to the crown, and conducting forbidden masses, all crimes punishable by the most brutal execution known to the Tudor state. And for a moment, the courtroom held its breath, waiting for Margaret's reply. For in Elizabethan England, the plea was more than a legal formality. It was the first step on a path that could lead either to the possibility of life or to the certainty of a horrific death. Margaret's response would become one of the most astonishing acts of defiance in the entire saga of Elizabethan persecution. For instead of pleading guilty or not guilty, she refused to enter any plea at all, declaring, "I know of no offense whereof I should confess myself guilty," and this single decision detonated like a bomb in the courtroom, for under English law, a refusal to plead created a legal stalemate, preventing the court from proceeding to trial. And yet, the Tudor system had devised a punishment so unimaginably savage that few ever dared persist in such silence. For those who refused to plead faced peine forte, endure the punishment of pressing a method of torture, where the condemned was laid upon the ground, a heavy wooden door placed across their chest, and increasingly massive weights piled upon the door until ribs splintered, Lungs collapsed and death arrived as a slow, excruciating surrender to crushing agony, and the judges, stunned that Margaret would choose such a fate, pleaded with her to reconsider, describing in ghastly detail the agony that awaited her. Yet Margaret's face remained composed, her voice steady as she declared that she would rather die than allow her children's servants or fellow Catholics to be forced under oath to testify against her, for she knew that a trial would become not merely a judgment of her own soul, but a trap to ensnare countless others in the machinery of Tudor torture and execution. And in that moment, Margaret transformed from a target of the state's wrath into a figure of almost supernatural courage, her silence becoming the ultimate weapon against a government addicted to confessions and public spectacle, revealing that in the war between faith and fear, words could be as deadly as any blade. The courtroom erupted into murmurs of disbelief, for few in Elizabethan England had ever witnessed such resolve, and even the hardened officials tasked with rooting out Catholic dissent seemed momentarily shaken by the spectacle of a woman so prepared to endure horrific death rather than betray those she loved. And Judge Clench tried once more to sway her, invoking the unborn child Margaret was rumored to be carrying, begging her to plead for the sake of the innocent life within her. Yet even this emotional appeal could not shake Margaret's decision, for she declared that she trusted God with the fate of her child, and her composure under such unimaginable pressure ignited whispers throughout the crowd. For in an age accustomed to the ritual confessions wrung from prisoners by torture, Margaret Clitherow stood alone, an unbroken spirit, refusing to feed the ravenous hunger of the state for public confessions and blood-soaked justice. Margaret's refusal to plead was not a mere act of stubbornness, but a calculated sacrifice, a brilliant maneuver designed to protect the network she had helped build for. Without a plea, no formal trial could proceed, no witnesses could be summoned, and no evidence could be read into the record, and so she forced the Crown into a horrific choice release, her a possibility too dangerous to contemplate or carry out the punishment of pressing a spectacle so barbaric that even Tudor officials hesitated to invoke it, for it was one thing to hang or behead a traitor, quite another to crush a woman to death beneath a mountain of stone. And yet Elizabethan England's commitment to religious conformity demanded that Margaret's silence be broken, no matter the cost. And so the machinery of her execution began to grind into motion. For in this hidden history of England, the Crown could tolerate dissent, only so long as it remained silent. And Margaret's silence had become louder than any words she could have spoken. 3 days separated Margaret from the crushing stones that awaited her, and during those final hours, she was confined in York Castle, writing letters to her husband and children, letters that survive to this day as haunting testaments to a faith that neither fear nor torture could extinguish. And as the days crawled past, word of her fate spread like wildfire through England's secret Catholic networks, transforming Margaret from a hidden figure of local resistance into a martyr whose name would echo through centuries. And though her captors hoped to break her spirit, Margaret's calm defiance only grew, for she believed with absolute certainty that her sacrifice would serve a greater purpose, revealing to the world the monstrous extremes to which Elizabethan England would go to maintain religious conformity. And as dawn crept closer to the day of her execution, the city of York held its breath. For all knew that what was about to unfold would be more than a mere punishment. It would be a dark performance of state power, a brutal spectacle designed to carve terror into the heart of every soul who dared to keep faith hidden beneath the floorboards of their homes. And as we now turn to the grim stage of Margaret's execution, we will see how her silence transformed the instruments of torture into symbols of faith, and how the crushing weight of stones could not extinguish the light of a woman determined to protect the hidden truth of her church. Dawn broke cold and gray over York on March 25th, 1586, the feast of the Annunciation in the Catholic calendar, a date whose sacred significance would have been known to Margaret Clitherow. And as the first pale light spilled over the city's tiled roofs and timbered streets, a grim preparation was underway behind the toll booth near York Castle. For there, in a narrow courtyard shrouded in the chill breath of early spring, stood the crude apparatus of one of England's most horrifying punishments, a punishment so brutal that even hardened executioners struggled to witness it. For this was not the quick, bloody efficiency of the axe or the spectacle of the gallows. This was pressing a calculated ritual of torture, where death arrived not swiftly, but slowly, inch by inch, as stones crushed ribs, splintered bone, and squeezed the life from a human body. And on this morning, the woman chosen for that fate was no hardened criminal, but a butcher's wife from the shambles, whose only crime had been to shelter priests and keep alive the forbidden rituals of her faith, revealing a dark history that Elizabethan England preferred to keep buried beneath the golden myths of its so-called enlightened age. For Margaret Clitherow was about to become a martyr not merely of Catholic resistance, but of a system that weaponized fear and pain to preserve religious conformity at any cost, proving that in the eternal battle between faith and fear, the instruments of torture could become the very forge of sainthood. Margaret was led from her cell shortly after sunrise, escorted by armed guards whose faces were etched with unease. For even among those tasked with carrying out the crown's cruelest orders, there was something about pressing that chilled the soul, and as she stepped into the courtyard, witnesses later claimed she appeared almost ethereal in her composure, dressed in her finest garments as though attending a solemn mass rather than her own execution. Her eyes shining not with terror, but with a calm resignation that seemed to transfix all who beheld her. And while Protestant ministers hovered nearby, making one last attempt to persuade her to renounce her faith and save her life, Margaret politely but firmly refused, for she knew that her silence, her refusal to plead, had set this path in stone. And no confession now would save her from the machinery of Elizabethan justice, a machine that demanded not merely obedience but the public spectacle of suffering, so that all who watched might be reminded that the cost of defying the crown was agony beyond imagining. The apparatus of pressing lay waiting, a heavy wooden door worn smooth from years of grim usage, sharp stones selected for their cruel angles positioned beneath it to ensure that every pound of weight would grind flesh and crush bone with relentless precision, and beside it neat piles of stones and iron weights were stacked, each one a silent testament to the calculated savagery that passed for justice in the courts of Elizabethan England. For pressing was not an accident of barbarism, but a deliberate tool designed to force confessions and to make examples of those whose silence threatened to shield wider conspiracies from the state's gaze. And today, Margaret Clitherow would become both victim and symbol, for the authorities believed that her execution would shatter the resolve of England's secret Catholics, yet instead it would etch her name into the annals of martyrdom, her death echoing far louder than any forced confession ever could, revealing a hidden truth about the fragility of power and the indestructible nature of faith. Margaret was instructed to lie down upon the ground, and without resistance, she obeyed, arranging herself with a dignity that left witnesses unable to reconcile her grace with the monstrous ritual about to unfold, and sharp stones were placed along her spine and shoulders, positioned to focus the crushing force upon her most vulnerable places, so that even the smallest addition of weight would send lances of agony through her body. And then the executioners lowered the wooden door over her, sealing her in darkness, her face hidden from view, leaving only the muffled sound of her breath. And this moment marked the point of no return. For once the pressing began, it would continue inexorably until the silence beneath the door became absolute. And as the first stones were laid upon the door, each thud reverberated like a drumbeat of doom, the grim rhythm of a death designed to break both flesh and spirit. And yet from beneath the crushing timber came faint whispers of prayer. Fragments of Latin psalms and Ave Marias for Margaret's resolve remained unbroken, even as her ribs began to bend under the weight, proving that faith could bloom even in the darkness of torture. The executioners worked methodically, adding stones in measured increments, for the law required the weight to increase, gradually ensuring that death would arrive neither swiftly nor mercifully, but only after the condemned had been given ample opportunity to recant and confess. And with each stone, Margaret's breaths grew shallower, her prayers weaker. Yet still she did not cry out, and those who stood near claimed they could hear bones cracking one by one, a sound that haunted witnesses for the rest of their lives. For pressing was a punishment not merely of the body but of the mind, designed to inflict such horror upon spectators that none would ever dare challenge the crown's authority again. And yet in Margaret's silence, the authorities found no triumph, for her refusal to scream became its own form of defiance, a silent sermon that exposed the savagery lurking beneath England's polished veneer of civilization. Some accounts suggest that the entire ordeal lasted as long as 15 minutes, though for Margaret time must have dissolved into an eternity of suffocating pressure, each heartbeat bringing her closer to the moment when her lungs could no longer expand. And as the final stones were added, witnesses reported that her prayers faded into silence, and the weight that pinned her to the earth finally extinguished the last fragile spark of life. And when the wooden door was lifted away, the full horror of what had been done became visible, for Margaret's body lay broken. Her bones shattered, her chest collapsed, and yet those who looked upon her claimed that her face bore an expression of peace, as though the suffering of the body had been transcended by the invincibility of her spirit. And thus Margaret Clitherow died not merely as a victim of the state's cruelty, but as a symbol of a faith that no torture could crush. Her pressing intended to instill terror, but instead forging an unbreakable legend whose echoes would outlive the very regime that condemned her, proving that in the war between faith and fear, sometimes the instruments of execution become the instruments of immortality. Yet as Margaret's lifeless body was carried away, Elizabethan officials realized too late that they had created a martyr whose name would be whispered in secret masses and commemorated in hidden prayers across England, for her death would ripple outward, strengthening the resolve of the very Catholics the Crown hoped to terrorize into silence. And as we turn next to the aftermath of Margaret's execution, we shall see how the brutal spectacle intended to quash resistance instead became the fuel for a legend, a story that would spread far beyond the gates of York to challenge the conscience of an entire nation. The stones that crushed Margaret Clitherow's chest had barely been lifted when the first whispers began to spread through the streets of York, like wind rustling through dry leaves, carrying a story so powerful that no official decree, no threat of torture could silence it. For the execution that was meant to stamp out rebellion had instead ignited the embers of legend, transforming a butcher's wife from the shambles into the Pearl of York, a name that would echo far beyond the bloody courtyard where she breathed her last. And as Margaret's broken body was carried away from the press, the city held its breath, for even those loyal to Elizabeth's crown could not deny the magnitude of what had just unfolded. A brutal execution so savage, so public, and so haunting that it left scars not only on the body of the woman it crushed, but on the collective conscience of an entire nation, revealing a hidden truth about the monstrous lengths to which power will go to maintain its grip, and proving that in the eternal war between faith and fear, the silence of a martyr could speak louder than the shouts of 1,000 torturers. Almost immediately, the authorities realized the magnitude of their blunder, for news of Margaret's death began racing through England's hidden Catholic networks with the speed and inevitability of blood flowing through veins carried by whispered conversations in market stalls, by coded letters tucked into shipments of cloth and spices, and by priests who moved like ghosts between safe houses. And what they carried was not merely the facts of Margaret's pressing, but the story of a woman who had refused to plead, refused to name names, and faced the crushing stones with prayers on her lips and forgiveness in her heart. And this narrative struck at the very heart of Elizabethan propaganda, undermining the crown's carefully crafted image of a benevolent monarch presiding over an enlightened golden age, for here was proof, undeniable, visceral proof, that beneath the fine velvet of the Tudor court lay instruments of torture, and that the price of defiance was agony beyond imagination, revealing the dark history that Elizabeth's regime preferred to bury under layers of political triumph and cultural achievement. Margaret's death became a rallying cry for Catholics across England and beyond, transforming private grief into public defiance, for secret masses were now offered not only for the souls of the faithful departed, but specifically, in Margaret's name, her memory invoked as both shield and sword against the relentless machinery of persecution. And as her story spread, embellished yet grounded in chilling truth, it inspired others to stand firm in their forbidden faith, even as the government sought desperately to contain the narrative. For Elizabeth's ministers understood that martyrs were dangerous, not merely because they defied the law, but because their deaths created legends that could travel farther, strike deeper, and last longer than any army or proclamation. And in this hidden history, the Pearl of York became a symbol whose luminance could not be extinguished, shining brightest, precisely because it had been forged in darkness and pain. While the government initially planned to bury Margaret in an unmarked grave, hoping to deny her body the honor that might transform it into a holy relic, pressure from her family and certain sympathetic officials forced a compromise, and Margaret was granted a proper burial, albeit under strict conditions and heavy guard to prevent Catholics from gathering relics or holding public vigils. Yet despite these precautions, fragments of her story slipped through the net, finding their way into Europe, where Catholic chroniclers seized upon the details of her execution as evidence of the barbarity lurking behind England's facade of religious reform, and in Catholic courts from Rome to Madrid, Margaret's name was whispered alongside prayers for intervention. Her story, woven into diplomatic arguments against Elizabeth's legitimacy for the image of a pregnant woman crushed to death beneath stones, was a weapon more potent than any sword, capable of swaying hearts and minds in ways that political treatises never could. Even among some Protestants, unease began to grow, for while many remained committed to Elizabeth's vision of Protestant supremacy, the sheer brutality of Margaret's death forced a reckoning with uncomfortable truths, sparking private debates about the limits of state power and the morality of executing women, especially pregnant women, for acts of conscience. And though few dared to speak publicly against the Crown's policies, diaries, letters, and private writings reveal a tremor of doubt spreading through segments of English society, suggesting that even the iron fist of Tudor authority could not completely silence the human instinct to recoil from cruelty. And in this quiet dissonance lay the seeds of future debates about religious tolerance and the proper limits of government over belief, proving that Margaret's pressing, intended as a demonstration of power, instead exposed the fragility of a regime willing to torture its own citizens to enforce religious conformity. Margaret's widowed husband, John Clitherow, found himself caught between two worlds, unable to publicly mourn his wife without risking suspicion, yet unable to simply carry on as though nothing had changed. And his quiet sorrow mirrored that of York's Catholic community, who grieved not only the loss of their leader, but the collapse of the safe house that had been their sanctuary for over a decade. And yet, amid the ashes of their secret chapel and the fear that hung thick in York's streets, something new was born, a legend powerful enough to sustain them through future waves of persecution. For Margaret's memory became a shield, a reminder that even under threat of torture, faith could endure, and that one woman's silence could roar louder than the sermons of 1,000 pulpits. And as secret gatherings continued in hidden chambers and remote barns, Margaret's name was spoken as both prayer and rallying cry. Her example reminding the faithful that the Crown might command armies and wield torture racks, but it could not extinguish the human spirit's hunger for freedom and truth. In the months following her execution, Margaret's story spread across Europe, fueled by priests like Father John Mush, who documented every detail of her sacrifice, ensuring that her memory would not be erased by the silence Elizabeth's government tried so desperately to impose. And even as Elizabeth's spies continued to hunt down Catholic resistance, the legend of the Pearl of York grew larger than the woman herself, a hidden truth shining through the darkness, proving that history is written not only by victors, but also by the voices of those who refuse to be silenced. And as we now turn to the long-term legacy of Margaret Clitherow, the path that would ultimately lead to her canonization as a saint, we shall see how the butcher's wife from York became an eternal symbol of resistance, courage, and the unbreakable bond between conscience and conviction, echoing across centuries to remind us that even in the most brutal chapters of human history, faith can transform suffering into immortality. Margaret Clitherow's story forces us to confront a brutal question that echoes across centuries. How can a civilization capable of creating breathtaking art, profound philosophy, and legal systems that still shape our world also commit unspeakable cruelty against a woman whose only crime was to believe differently? It's easy to dismiss atrocities as relics of a distant, barbaric past, but the hidden truth is that the same forces still lurk beneath the surface of modern society, waiting for fear and fanaticism to give them new shape. Margaret's agonizing death under the crushing stones wasn't merely an Elizabethan tragedy. It's a reminder that even today, power can mask itself in the language of virtue, that dark history can repeat itself when we look away, and that the human cost of silencing dissent is always paid in blood and broken bodies. But amid the horror, her story offers something else, a fierce, luminous hope that courage, even when it seems impossibly small, can outlast empires. The Pearl of York teaches us that true freedom isn't given by rulers, it's claimed by individuals willing to risk everything for conscience, and that sometimes silence speaks the loudest truth of all. So as you step away from this video, ask yourself, what hidden truths are we ignoring today? Where is faith or freedom being pressed to death in silence? If Margaret's story moved you or challenged you, let's keep this conversation alive. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Tell me how this dark history changes how you see our own world. And if you believe these untold stories deserve to be heard, don't forget to like, save, and share this video, and subscribe to the channel for more journeys into the hidden corners of our human past. Because sometimes the only thing standing between civilization and the darkness is the courage to remember.